Hi students, I'm going to go over parts 2 and 3 of Allen Ginsberg's Howl with you, so bear with me. Okay, so as we talked over part 1, it really was this kind of constant repetition of this who, starts out with us just kind of trying to figure out who it is that Ginsberg is addressing, right? Who's the subject, which we have gathered is really just the lost generation. Now we start getting into the how of like what's going on, right? And so you'll see that there's at the very beginning, what sphinx of cement aluminum bashed open their skull and ate up their brains and imagination, right? Which is a reference to ancient Egyptians, this mythical creature, the sphinx, which is a human head on an animal body, like a monster, basically, right? And so I pulled up, here's some pictures of a sphinx. So this is what he's referring to, the sphinx of ancient Egypt. But it's interesting because in this case, it's referring to a cement and aluminum one, right? Really just like the industrial monster, and I think about buildings, right? Gigantic buildings and skyscrapers, right? So in this case, and then there's this repetition of Moloch, Moloch, Moloch over and over. And as I told you before, Ginsberg is a Jew, so he's actually referencing a Jewish myth about this myth about sacrificing children to Moloch, which was not something that was allowed. It was obviously not okay. But in this case, it could be a metaphor, right, for war or the United States sending in children to the sacrificial lamb of war, right? So it could be a reference to that. And then it keeps going on, and then Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery, another reference to capitalism, industry, war, progress, right? It could be any of those things. Moloch, whose blood is running money, right? So again, Wall Street, right? So that all could be a reference to that. And then I'm not going to go into all these, but it just keeps going and going. And then Moloch, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasures, blind capitals, demonic industries, special natures. I mean, it just goes on and on. And really, it's a conversation about anti-conservatism of the 50s, suburbs, perfection, the American dream. It's really anti all of those things. Like all of those things are Moloch, essentially. And so he's really personifying like the time in America. And then there's this sort of despairs, 10 years, animal screams and suicide, minds, new loves, mad generation, down on the rocks of time. Is really a reference to World War II, which lasted about 10 years. So there's that. And then he goes into referencing Carl Solomon. So I don't know if I said this, but Carl Solomon, who this poem is dedicated to, as you can see at the top, he was in a sane asylum in Rockland with Ginsberg. So this is true. This really happened. And so Ginsberg is dedicating this poem to this man who he saw just, again, was very strange, had a lot of problems, and he just became kind of obsessed with the guy. But, basically he's talking about him being in straitjackets, being catatonic, so dead or lifeless, and then where 50 more shocks will never return her soul to its body again from its pilgrimage to cross in the void. So just lost, right? The Walking Dead again. Just in a different sense, just like T.S. Eliot. And then there's this reference to Golgotha. So where you accuse your doctors of insanity and plot the Hebrew Socialist Revolution against the fascist national Golgotha. So Golgotha is actually Calvary, and Calvary was where Jesus was crucified. So that's what that reference is all about. Again, going back to the wasteland, we talked about, the murder of Christ, and it could be just again another metaphor for hope, a metaphor for a new beginning, a metaphor for resurrection, right? It could be all of those things. And then there's a reference to veterans who are suffering from PTSD, which he says, where there are 25,000 mad comrades altogether singing the final stanzas of the Internationale. So, you know, basically he's in this institution and there's just a ton of soldiers, right? Like they just all were there dealing with their PTSD. And this is interesting, where we hug and kiss the United States under our bed sheets, the United States that coughs all night and won't let us sleep. So the United States is personified as a sick person. So that's kind of interesting, right? Where we wake up electrified out of a coma. This is a reference to shock treatment, which was common in those days in these insane asylums. And then this I really love. Oh, star-spangled shock of mercy and eternal war is here. Oh, victory, forget your underwear, we're free. And then I just asked the question, are we free? What is the price of freedom? Like, again, I just think he's kind of referencing that. And then there's the footnote that's at the very bottom of the poem, if you look, and I pulled it up, and you didn't have to read it, but if you do look at it, there's references to, you know, Solomon, Kerouac, Burroughs, and Cassidy, just a bunch of important beats and people of the time who were really like involved in the beat movement, part of the Lost Generation. And I mean, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but if you look, it's interesting. This whole thing about holy forgiveness, mercy, charity, faith, holy, ours, body, suffering, magnanimity. I felt like this was a strong connection to what the Thunder said at the end of The Wasteland, when he says, you know, peace. You know, there's like the offering between Da and Dada, like the conversation about charity and self-control. And compassion. It just kind of reminded me of it. It kind of just ends the way that really The Wasteland does. Like, is there going to be charity? Is there going to be mercy? Is there going to be forgiveness? We don't know, right? It's again, it's up to interpretation. So anyway. Okay, so hopefully that helped with understanding a little bit more about the last two sections of Howl. And if you guys have any questions, let me know. And in this video, I'm going to go over parts 2 and 3 of Howl. So let's go ahead and turn to the poem. Okay, so if you remember in the first part of the poem, it's really talking about the Who, right? And if we want to figure out who the Who is, I really believe it's the Lost Generation, right? He's talking about all the different people who are part of that generation, his generation. And then number 2, we start to get into some interesting territory. So there's a reference to the Sphinx. What Sphinx of cement of aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination. And so this is really a reference to the Sphinx in Egypt. And if you could see, like, basically it's a human head on the body of an animal. And so it's interesting, like, something about it is monstrous. And although here it's described as cement and aluminum, so it could be a reference to skyscrapers in New York City, right? Like that is the new kind of monster, right, in this modern time. And then there's a reference to Moloch. Moloch, solitude, filth, ugliness, ash cans, and unobtainable dollars, children screaming under the stairways, right? And this is really a Jewish reference to this mythical creature that people would sacrifice their children to, which was, you know, not allowed. But it could also be a metaphor for war, sending your children off to die, right? Or even the U.S. sending its children off to war. And so it depends on how you want to look at that metaphor, but it could have those angles to it. And then Moloch is just repeated throughout. There's a reference to Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery, Moloch, whose blood is running money. It's really a reference to, you know, capitalism, to war, to industry and progress, right? Again, just like The Wasteland, really questioning these progressive ideas, these progressive things, such as industry and, you know, capitalism. And then there's, you know, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries. Also a reference to everything really that the Lost Generation stood for and that the Beat Generation stood for, which was anti-conservative 50s, anti-suburban life, anti-perfection, anti this American dream idea, right, which was just starting to kind of be developed. And then this reference to World War II. Despairs, 10 years, animal screams and suicides, minds, new loves, mad generation, down on the rocks of time. Really, 10 years was how long World War II lasted. So it's kind of a reference to that. And then we get to part 3, which is all about Carl Solomon and Rockland. And so just some little trivia. Allen Ginsberg did write this in his time when he was at Rockland, which is a real insane asylum that he spent time in. And he did meet a man named Carl Solomon. He did dedicate this poem to him. And he really became fascinated with this character. And so he really talks a lot about how he notices this man. He describes him as catatonic, really just lifeless, dead, really like the Walking Dead, just like in The Wasteland. And where 50 more shocks will never return your soul to its body again from its pilgrimage to cross into a void, right? Again, lost generation. This could also be a reference to shock treatments, which were common in that time in insane asylums, which, he did see happen to people. And then there's a reference to where you accuse your doctors of insanity and plot the Hebrew socialist revolution against the fascist national Golgotha. And that's actually cavalry, which is a reference to where Jesus was crucified, which connects back to the Wasteland, right? Because that was referenced there as well. So there's that. And then there's talk about where there were 25,000 man comrades all together singing the final stanzas of the Internationale. So he's really referencing all of the soldiers and veterans that have come back from war that are in these wards, suffering from trauma, suffering from PTSD, really just forgotten and put aside. And then I love this where it says, where we hug and kiss the United States under our bed sheets, the United States that coughs all night and won't let us sleep. So the United States is kind of personified here as someone that's sick, right? Someone that's ill. And that's really sort of fascinating too. And then I love this last part where it's all, oh, star-spangled shock of mercy, the eternal war is here. Oh, victory, forget your underwear, we're free. And then I ask the question, like, are we free? And what's the price of that freedom, right? Is madness the price of that freedom? So anyway, just a question. And then down here, the footnote that he included is here for the entire poem itself. And if you notice, like, it just goes holy, holy, holy. But what's interesting about it is it really reminds me of that last part of The Wasteland, what the thunder said. Like here it says, holy forgiveness, mercy, charity, faith, holy, ours, body, suffering, magnanimity. Like, again, right, like the da and dada thing at the end of The Wasteland where they're talking about charity and self-control and compassion. Again, this kind of connects back. And you could take a similar kind of feeling like, is this a hopeful ending? Is this a non-hopeful ending? I don't know. It's really up to you. Okay, so I hope that little helped a little bit with you guys trying to understand Howl a little bit better. And if you guys have questions, please let me know.